Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here, thanks for watching. So in this video I'm going to continue my discussion of John Locke, the 17th century British philosopher. So this serves as part 2 of my video series on John Locke. So I concluded part 1 of my video series on Locke discussing his theory of human nature, just very introductory ideas about his theory of human nature. And remember, my discussion involved thinking about his theory of the state of nature. And the aspect of the theory of human nature that I touched on was the fact that he claims that everybody is morally equal. So this is different from Hobbes' views. For those of you who remember what I said about Hobbes' view of equality, Hobbes focused on our mental and physical equality, and he denied the fact that there was any such thing as intrinsic moral equality. Here's where Locke diverges greatly from that of Hobbes. Locke thinks that we all have the same intrinsic moral worth. So this tells us something about our nature. We're valuable and we have an intrinsic value as human beings. Now the question is where does this value ultimately come from? Well, on Locke's view, it comes from God. So God endows us all with a kind of intrinsic moral worth. And so this is an important break in the development of Locke's theory of the state of nature, this aspect of human nature. Now, I also mentioned in my discussion in part 1 of my video series on Locke that according to Locke, this laws of nature are going to be binding on us, externally speaking. So in a state of nature, there's going to be others, some entity or entities are going to have the authority to enforce the laws of nature on others. So when people violate the laws of nature, they can be punished. And that's interesting given other things that Locke says. So Locke says that what's essential to a state of nature is that there's no political power. So Locke recognizes this tension and knows he needs to give an argument for this, as he claims strange doctrine. The strange doctrine being that the laws of nature, these principles that we get from God, can be binding on us despite the fact that there's nobody with political authority to enforce them on us. Okay, so I need to develop Locke's argument for this view. But keep in mind that Locke thinks that in a state of nature we're free. So in this way he agrees with Hobbes. But he thinks that true freedom in a state of nature involves constraining one's actions to the laws of nature. So whereas Hobbes doesn't think that we can be constrained, externally speaking, by the laws of nature, given that Locke thinks that we can be constrained, externally speaking, by the laws of nature, true freedom in a state of nature for Locke is going to involve being constrained by the laws of nature. So doing whatever you want, but being constrained by the laws of nature as you interact with others. We've already seen from part 1 of my video series on Locke that Locke's ethics is altruistic in nature, meaning that there are some principles, some very quasi-fundamental principles at the very least, which are altruistic in nature, meaning that they are for the sake of their duties they live to for the sake of other people and the interests of other people. Okay, so these are just important differences between Hobbes and Locke and how they're conceiving the state of nature. So the first thing to note here, before I get to discussing this very important argument to defend the strange doctrine that I mentioned a moment ago, first thing to note, again, is that Hobbes and Locke, they disagree on whether the laws of nature are binding in an external sense in a state of nature. Hobbes says they aren't, and Locke says they are, and that's why I need to give an argument. They differ on the nature of human equality. Locke, he focuses on our intrinsic moral equality, not meaning that we all have the same moral beliefs, etc., but that we all have the same value as human beings. Okay, so this is in line with maybe how we think about equality, moral equality, nowadays in contemporary times. And then lastly, Hobbes and Locke think differently on the nature of freedom. Hobbes' view is that you can do whatever you want in a state of nature because externally speaking, because there's no one to prevent you from doing anything. Everybody has a right to everything because nobody has a property right to anything. Nobody has a political right to anything, put more generally. Whereas Locke thinks that in a state of nature, when you're truly free, you're acting in a way that's constrained by the laws of nature. Okay, so those are some important differences. Now let's get to this key argument that Locke wants to give us for the claim that that the laws of nature are externally binding in a state of nature, meaning that there are some individuals, something that have the authority to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. I remember this is supposed to be a thorny issue because there's no common political power to do any enforcing. We're in a state of nature. So here's the argument. The passage that Hobbes develops in chapter 2 of Second Treatise of Government isn't the clearest, so I'll try to make it as clear as possible. So the argument goes something like this. Imagine that you have a political society. So the structure of the society is such that there's a sovereign or a prince, as Locke calls the sovereign, and you have citizens or subjects. And imagine you have a political society, and you have some foreigner, and the foreigner comes into this political society and violates the law of nature. So let's just say that he violates the law of nature. That would involve, say, harming someone in that political society, someone who's a member of that political society. Now, if we imagine that, Locke thinks that we're going to be inclined, and rightly so, to think that the prince would have the authority to punish the foreigner in such circumstances. I mean, the foreigner, after all, came in and violated the law of nature within the political jurisdiction of the prince. And so Locke thinks that it's quite natural that we would think that the prince has the right to enforce the laws of nature. And he thinks that we're right in thinking this, as I've noted. But then he goes a step further and says that since this is right, since we're right to think this, then given that nobody's superior to anybody else in a state of nature, everyone has the right to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. So it's not going to be one person. It's not just going to be some group of people. It's going to be everyone having the authority to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. So step one, just to put the argument succinctly, step one, if a prince has the authority to punish a foreigner, right, then everyone, given that everyone's equal in a state of nature, has the authority to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. I'm thinking about what the prince is doing. He's enforcing the laws of nature. Okay, he thinks it's right that the prince has the authority to punish the foreigner, to enforce the laws of nature with respect to the foreigner's activity in his political jurisdiction. So the conclusion that follows then is that everyone, right, given that nobody's superior to anybody else in a state of nature, has the right to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. Okay, so since, to put the argument perhaps even more simply, since the prince has the right or the authority to enforce the laws of nature against the foreigner, that everyone has the authority to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature. Okay, we wish that Locke said more, but what's going on here? I think that we can deduce what he has in mind by running this argument. And you might think there's something tricky about it because Locke is using an idea of a political society where there's political authority in the first place to run an argument for the conclusion that in a state of nature everyone has the authority to enforce the laws of nature. You might think there's something problematic about that. In fact, that's not really problematic given a broader understanding of what it means to be in a state of nature. So here's what we should be thinking. Okay, if we do our best to interpret Locke here, think about the relationship that holds between the prince and the foreigner. If we make the individual truly a foreigner, someone who's not part of the political society, well, then it looks like that relationship is one of a state of nature. There's no common political power holding between the prince of that political society and the foreigner outside that political society. So there's a very general state of nature relationship that holds between the prince and the foreigner. So if the prince can punish a foreigner in this state of nature relationship, then why not in others? Why not just generally? So you might think that the prince-foreigner case is really kind of precedence case. It establishes a precedence for the possibility of there being enforcements of the laws of nature in a state of nature relationship. So then why not generally? So that's why he thinks he can conclude with and claim that everyone, very generally, in a state of nature, has the right to enforce the laws of nature. Okay, so that seems to be the justification. Okay, so remember, the prince and the foreigner stand in a state of nature relationship because there's no common political authority over either of them. Okay, and so then that, given that holds in that case, then why not generally in a state of nature relationship? Okay, so I call this the prince-foreigner argument, and it's used to establish the claim that everyone has the authority to enforce the laws of nature in a state of nature, and this explains ultimately why it is that the laws of nature are going to be externally binding for Locke in a state of nature. People are going to have the authority to enforce the laws of nature, and the laws of nature are thus going to be externally binding this way. But according to Locke, it's important that everyone has this authority, not just people who are selected by the members of the society. And this is important because once you have a selection process, you have something like a political society forming. So it has to be the case that we keep in mind that Locke's claiming that in the state of nature itself, where there is no common political power, where there is no political authority, everyone has the right to enforce the laws of nature. Okay? So we'll come back to this argument, we'll circle back to this argument in a bit, so I want to push forward and continue developing Locke's view. So hopefully we're in a good position where we're understanding Locke's theory of the state of nature, and I like to compare it with that of Hobbes, because it gives us some context for understanding how Locke's view is different from that of a view that we already understand. Okay, so what Locke goes on to do after running this argument, he says, okay, everyone has then the right to enforce laws of nature, state of nature. Okay, he's defended that strange idea, as he put it. He says, though, that once we think carefully about human nature and how human beings tend to be biased towards those who are close to them, like their family and their close friends, then a problem emerges in a state of nature. So keep in mind that for Locke, a state of nature is not a state of war. A state of war can occur in a state of nature, but it's not necessarily a state of war. So here he disagrees with Hobbes yet again. Okay, so this is really important. So a state of nature can be a state of war, but it's not necessarily one as Hobbes thought before him. Okay? In a state of nature, given that everyone has the right to enforce the laws of nature, on Locke's view, given human nature, given the fact that we tend to be biased, partial, when we enforce the laws of nature on those who have done wrong and they're strangers, we're going to tend to be quite harsh in our punishments. When we enforce the laws of nature against those who violate the laws of nature for those who are loved ones, we're going to be much more lenient. Okay, and so on Locke's view, this is a problem. This is a problem because we're not acting justly, we're not acting in the way that we should when we're partial or biased in our enforcements of the laws of nature. So on Locke's view, this gives us an initial justification for exiting the state of nature. We should exit the state of nature so that way we can form a political society where we transfer, right, our right to enforce the laws of nature, and we transfer that to a sovereign, to a prince, to an authority, to then have that right to make sure that we are more impartially enforcing the laws of nature. So I'll pick up with part 2 of my video series on Locke in a moment. Thanks for watching, everybody.